When you're truly unmistakable, the competition becomes completely irrelevant. You're not the best option, you're the only option. When you're the only option, people don't price shop, compare, or wait for what you're selling to go on sale. If you're the only option, people will wait in line to buy your product or work with you regardless of what it costs, or in some cases, regardless of what you're selling. I'm Srinivas Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, being recorded live in Portland, Oregon. I am your host. I am your temporary host. My name's Matt Monroe, and for the next 45 minutes, we are going to shift gears. We are going to crank the mics and the speakers up to 11, and more importantly, we're going to take Srini Rao, the real host of this show, and put him in the hot seat. Ladies and gentlemen, Srini Rao. Srini, I have been wanting to say this for the longest time. Welcome to the Unmistakable Creative Podcast.
It is really, really weird because I don't think anybody's done this for 5 years. Somebody else did it once before, but this was a long time ago.
And it wasn't even the Unmistakable Creative Podcast back then.
No.
So you have a brand new book out.
Yeah.
In fact, first of all, everyone should get it. It is called Why Only is Better Than Best, Unmistakable. And I really want to spend a good amount of time talking about the book, why you wrote it, how you wrote it, what the inspirations for the book were, but I also want to dig into your past just a little bit, because I think by going into a person's past, you find out what their present, I was about to say present condition is, their present situation is, why they're doing what they're doing, and we'll then end up talking a little bit about the future, where you see media going. For right now, though, if you would, give me 3 adjectives that describe your childhood.
Sure. I think the first one is nomadic. The second one I would say sporadic, and the third one I would say is strict.
Nomadic,
yeah.
Sporadic, and strict. Okay, could you give me an example of nomadic?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up kind of traveling all over the world. My dad is a college professor, but my dad was building his career mostly while I was growing up. So my sister and I have had these very radically different upbringings because she got to see what it was like to grow up in the same town for 20 years and have the same friends that she's had since 5th grade, where, she's attended all of their weddings, like all that stuff. And I don't have any friends that I've known any longer than 20 years. Mainly because we moved so much when I was a kid. And what's interesting is a lot of those people have started showing up again in my life as a byproduct of the internet and as a byproduct of the Unmistakable Creative, like friends from college, friends from when I was a kid. So it's really bizarre to have these connections happen 30 plus years later. Probably one of the funniest things that ever happened to me in terms of seeing somebody almost 20 years after I actually met them. I was walking through Tamarindo, Costa Rica. This was a point when I was living there, and I was wearing a Texas A&M t-shirt. And the woman who ran the youth hostel happened to be walking around that night, and she was walking with these 2 guys, and they saw the shirt. They're like, "Where did you get that shirt?" And I was like, "Well, I lived in College Station for 7 years." They're like, "We're from College Station." And, so it was like we got to talking, and it turned out the guy was a kid that I was in 6th grade with. And somehow, we had never, had a class together, but we knew of each other. And he didn't believe me. I was like, "I can tell you who all your best friends were at 6th grade if you don't believe me." And I knew it, and he was just stunned. I mean, he couldn't believe. And so it was really funny that, of all places in Tamarindo, you meet this person from your past who you never actually met, but you only knew of, like peripherally. Like we never were in the same class, but we had tons of friends in common. So we started moving. I mean, so my dad did his PhD in Australia. We spent 4 years in Canada, in Edmonton, which is why I hate cold weather with a passion, and will never live anywhere where it snows. And besides, brown people in cold weather are an unnatural combo, which doesn't explain New Jersey, but that's a whole other story. So then we moved to Texas. Not that there are a lot of brown people in Texas, but
Mucha gente se ya.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. So Texas, my dad did postdoctoral work there for 7 years, and then he got a job as a professor at the University of California, Riverside when I was a sophomore in high school. So, I spent my whole life moving and constantly making new friends. So, when I look back at it, if you tie it to the work that I'm doing now, it's not a coincidence that I've built a platform that never the possibility of meeting people is never ending.
Do you think culture shock was part of your life? I mean, you're going Australia to Canada, which probably there's not much difference. But then you're going
Canada to Texas was a big one.
Okay.
Yeah, because in Canada, we had this very vibrant Indian community. My parents had hundreds of friends. I mean, I can't think of 1 week, maybe I can think of 2 weekends in 4 years where my parents didn't have some party to go to that, you grew up with these kids. Every weekend we would go to somebody's house and, our parents would basically bundle us up and, they'd tell us, get ready, we're leaving in 15 minutes. And you're sitting there like, in layers and layers of clothing. You're like, I have to go to the bathroom. They're like, don't worry, we're leaving in 15 minutes. Like you said that 15 minutes ago. So Canada was not really culture shock, but Texas absolutely was a big change. To go from a big city like Edmonton, Alberta, to a small Texas town like College Station was very disorienting. My parents for the first year were bored out of their minds. They just hated it because the one and only friend that they had ended up moving to India like months after we got there. And it was really weird to be at this place where we didn't have stuff to go to on the weekends. We didn't have this community. And, you go from a place where you're surrounded by Indian people to a place where you're one of the only ones.
Okay. So I don't want to dig too much, but how do you think that affected you?
Well, I mean, if you look at, I guess if you look at my friendships, we could probably all get together and record a commercial for the United Colors of Benetton. Maybe that's how it affected me, because my friendships are all very diverse. Like, it's like I said, I mean, I think the weirdest thing about having an internet presence is seeing all these people from different parts of your past connect to this one thing that you do.
Okay. Amateur psychologist time.
Yeah.
Amateur psychologist time. So we've covered nomadic and a bit of sporadic. What about strict?
Strict, I mean, Indian parents, right? They had certain expectations. Like, I mean, we didn't get our report cards put on the refrigerator for getting straight A's. It was like, that's what's expected of you. Like, why would we give you, I mean, we would come home from school and we'd learn something some American kid taught us and we'd try to pull it on our parents. It's like, hey, one of my friends is getting $5 for every A that he gets. My dad's like, you're getting fed a meal 3 times a day. I think we're good here, There's actually this really great stand-up comedy bit with this guy Russell Peters where he talks about this kid who is really talking back to his mom, and it's an American kid, and he goes home and he tries it with his mom. And, needless to say, the consequences were not great. I learned that lesson, and that's why it's so funny to every Indian kid, because every one of us has learned that lesson. We're like, wow. And he goes to school, he says, dude, I tried what you said with your mom, and he's like, I got the shit beat out of me because of that. So, not that I ever got the hell beat out of me, but they were strict. I mean, they had certain expectations for, what was, what we were supposed to do. I mean, like, we were good students, that was a given. And we were always encouraged to do certain things, like a very sort of narrow set of things. I mean, I must have been told a number of times growing up, if you want a good life, become a doctor.
Sure, become a doctor or become an engineer.
Which, maybe my sister heard it because she did.
Right. But here's the interesting thing to me. Your book, Unmistakable, Why Only is Better... I messed that up. Why Only is Better Than Best. I mean, this is a book about bucking the system, about not following the rules, about breaking the rules, about, woohoo, everybody. Woo! All right. But no, really, this is a book about breaking the rules, but you grew up told you will do this, you will follow this path.
Right.
What made you break away?
The results, they were abysmal. I mean, so most people, I think, end up, in situations where, okay, if they're told what to do, they might be unhappy, but they're comfortable at least, right? And the results are pretty average. It's like, okay, I don't love this job, but, I'm at least making a paycheck and, doing relatively well. I'm, a valuable member to society, whatever the hell that means. But my results were just abysmal. They were terrible. I mean, I got fired from every real job I've ever been at. So you're kind of like, at a certain point, you're like, okay, this is idiotic. Only a fool would not begin to question this. I was like, I don't want to live this way the rest of my life. Every one of my friends. The other thing is I've been surrounded by high-achieving people my entire life. Like, I went to Berkeley as an undergrad. I mean, the dumbest of my friends in high school went to Berkeley. And then my Berkeley friends, every one of them either went to Harvard, Stanford, or Wharton for business school, or they became doctors and lawyers. So, they're like total overachievers. And I'm kind of like, how is this not working? I've followed this formula that supposedly is the prescription for a good life, and it doesn't work. I'm like, then it has to be called into question at some point. So, for some people, yeah, maybe it works, but I mean, for me, I think the greatest gift to come from all of that was that the results were so bad.
Interesting. I'm going to backtrack just a
Sure.
bit. All your friends are high achieving, but are they all happy?
That I can't tell you because I'm not as close to as a lot of them as I used to be.
Okay.
Many of them are, but
Are they happy
actually,
or are they comfortable?
I would say a lot of them are comfortable. I actually saw a friend recently, and he's pretty much achieved everything you would think you'd want in your life. At the age of 30, he has a kid. And they have a nice house in Redondo Beach. And I watched this Saturday, and we had a lengthy chat. He said, he's like, I've been feeling down, and I kind of spent a Saturday with him. I was like, wow. I'm like, no wonder you're feeling down. Your Saturday is like just routines. Like there's no sense of greater meaning or purpose. There's nothing that adds meaning to his life beyond his work and his family. And I think that's critically important to have something that does. For me, that thing has been surfing. And so I looked at it and I was like, okay, that made all the sense in the world to me. I was like, I would be down if that was my routine every day. He's become so domesticated that at a certain point, you're like, okay, if you're living like this, you're living Groundhog Day, and of course you're going to feel that way, in my mind.
You mentioned surfing.
Yeah.
It's a huge theme within the book.
Sure.
How was surfing a pivotal moment for you? Learning to surf and actually getting on top of a wave, or riding a wave?
I think, it all comes down to this one moment. I was finishing a semester in Brazil where I'd done a study abroad, and all my friends went home early because they ran out of money. And we were all supposed to be together for New Year's Eve, and I was like, great. So I was stuck with this guy, and we had nothing in common. But he liked to surf, and I was kind of tired of sitting on the beach drinking. And so it was like it was 2 days before I came home. I was like, all right, you know what? I'm going to try and just give it one more shot. And I'd probably tried about 5 or 10 times before that, and I just never could get up. Even taking lessons. I mean, the first time I took a surf lesson, the guy in San Diego, the instructor said, it's a really good thing you took a lesson, otherwise you would have hurt yourself. He probably figured I was a lost cause. I mean, I have no natural athletic ability, so it's not your first choice, of sports. But for some reason that day in Brazil, it just clicked. And there's two things that happened. So there's another thing that's worth mentioning. I had really bad digestive problems. I had IBS for years. That was the byproduct of a really stressful job that I started my freshman year, or right after my senior year in college. And for the first time in my life, that really just sort of a heavy feeling, for the first time since, I was in college, that heavy feeling was gone right after I got out of the water. And I was kind of like, oh my God, I think I found the cure. And I was like, well, this is convenient. I happened to be going to graduate school in Malibu. And so when I got my financial aid check, I didn't go to the bookstore, I went to the surf shop. And I bought a wetsuit and a board, and the rest is kind of history. I mean, that summer ended up being really the pivotal one because I didn't have a job. And so I surfed for 6 hours a day for 8 months straight.
I'm actually going to have you read a passage from your book.
Okay.
Because it's exactly in line with what you've been talking about.
Yeah.
I would like to have you read what's underlined there.
When I stood up on a wave, every ounce of fear, anxiety, depression, and self-doubt didn't just dissipate, it vanished. Even though I was jobless, surviving primarily on peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and sleeping on the living room floor of an apartment that was once mine, for the first time in my adult life, I experienced unparalleled joy.
That's fantastic. So surfing was a pivotal moment, and at the same time you're realizing you're on a career path. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've got an MBA.
Yeah.
You're following the rules and it's not providing satisfaction. What did you do next?
Well, it's not that it wasn't just providing satisfaction, it wasn't working.
Well, okay, so the economy sucked too.
Yeah, I mean, so right after I graduated, I needed something to keep my mind occupied, and I got a really good piece of advice from somebody. He said the worst thing you can do when you're unemployed is to spend all your time looking for a job, which seems really counterintuitive. But the thing is that if you spend all day, doing this one thing that constantly reinforces the worst thing in your life, then of course you're going to feel terrible. So it was good advice, and I was kind of like, okay, you know what? I can limit the job search to an hour a day. And so the other thing I did was I started a blog, and I started surfing. So the blog was kind of, the reason I started it, which is really kind of ironic if you actually look at the motivation for starting it was I was applying for jobs in social media positions. I was like, okay, I need some tangible evidence of my skills because my resume doesn't really indicate that. And so that was the reason. And of course that ship sailed really far off course because me and a job are clearly not meant to be.
World's worst employee?
Yeah, probably.
Me too.
One of the worst.
Boom. Sorry, had to do that. So, all right, you started a blog. What came after that?
So after the blog, there was a weekend sometime, I think, in late July something like mid or late July, where I went to LA at this apartment that a friend of mine had agreed to rent. He said, look, he's like, if I don't have to pay the deposit, you can come and sleep here anytime you want. And I still had a lease that hadn't run out yet. So I was like, yeah, that's fine. So this is the living room floor that I was speaking of. And so I would go there because, there's no jobs. I had to move home right after graduate school. But I would go to LA because there were networking events going on, and job interviews primarily were in LA because that's where I was looking. And somehow I had this Wednesday through Sunday period where all the job interviews for some reason got rescheduled or canceled. And I was like, well, okay, there's nothing else to do. I'm not going to sit here all day. So I surfed every day for 5 days straight, from like 7 in the morning to like 6 in the evening. And that was kind of the end of it. From there, it was like, okay, I guess me and a normal job are never meant to be. And, even when I went into interviews, I was like, you guys need to know this. This is a priority. I will be a much better employee. And if you guys have a problem with this, we're done. I started scheduling all my phone interviews from the beach. I built the entire schedule, around surfing. I was kind of like, no, I can't. They would say, can you come in at 9 in the morning? I would say no. And they'd say, why? I'm like, I have other plans. And I did.
Really important appointments.
I did. I remember one day I got out of the water and the guy was like, what's that in the background? I'm like, it's the ocean. I'm like, but you want to have a phone interview, right? He's like, you're at the beach? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, why wouldn't I do a phone interview from the beach? So, and that just, at that point, it started to take over my life. I was kind of like, but the thing is that it was this thing that made this job search, this thing that was really troubling, not seem so bad. It was kind of like, wow, this isn't that big a deal right now. Like it honestly got me through it. And, part of what I think I discovered in that process was that this was this very therapeutic healing thing that, it turned out that everybody who surfed had this thing in common. I remember very distinctly, and I wrote about this in the book. I talked to this old guy on the beach. I was, you're rinsing off at the showers at the beach in Santa Monica, and we were both talking. And and if you have a big blue foam surfboard, everybody knows that you're basically a beginner.
Right.
And it's a sign that you're
training wheels.
They are training wheels. Like advanced surfers stay away from them because like, okay, you're an idiot if you're carrying one of those. And, I was getting actually quite good because I was spending so much time in the water. And so we got to talking, and he told me that, it was surfing that had gotten him through a divorce and the death of his mother. I was like, okay, wait a minute. If that's, clearly there's something very special here. This thing became sort of the, and I remember there was a point at which somebody said, one of my friends said, somebody told me that they thought surfing was ruining your life, which is amusing since, my entire career has been transformed by it. So I think really what it comes down to, I said this the other, like in something that I was writing the other day, so Joseph Campbell said once, follow your bliss, right? But your bliss and your calling don't necessarily have to be one and the same. So like my bliss is surfing. It's not my calling. I'm not going to be a professional surfer.
You're not Laird Hamilton.
No, and I never will be for good reason.
Right. Very good. Let's jump ahead. Let's talk about the podcast for just a little bit, its origins, and then we'll go straight into the book.
Okay.
So tell me the story of Unmistakable Creative and actually its precursor.
So how it started really was I was in this online course, and one of the lessons was interview somebody as a way to get traffic to your blog. And if there's anything that this experience taught me, and this is one thing I would pass on to people listening, is you should never follow anybody's instructions to the letter, especially if you're taking an online course, because if you leave those instructions open to interpretation, you're going to end up with a lot more interesting outcomes. So the lesson was do one interview as a way to get traffic, because every week you'd get a lesson in your inbox, and your job was to complete that lesson. And since I didn't have an actual job, every week that was my work. I basically would write on this blog, I would apply for jobs, and I would surf. And so I think it was probably like week 11, the lesson was interview somebody. So I went on the online forum and I said, hey, I'm trying to complete lesson number 11, because these courses often have forums where all the people who are enrolled in the course are that. And this guy named Josh Hannigarney, who is a librarian with Tourette's, who runs a blog called The World's Strongest Librarian, because he's like a kettlebell weightlifter.
F-bomb Tourette's? Or
I don't know. It's not that bad. I mean, enough. Clearly, he got through an interview with me, so there weren't that many F-bombs. But it was really, really interesting. And so he ended up being the very first interview that I ever did. And he said to me, don't underestimate what this is going to do for you. And what's really interesting is when I walked into my literary agent's office for the first time in New York, the first book I saw on her shelf was his book. I was like, you won't believe this, but that is the first person I ever interviewed.
Do you believe in serendipity?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, I'm not into new age bullshit, you know that. But,
I know that, yeah.
You know, which is what I constantly refer to it as.
Yeah,
even though I'm sure there are people in our audience who are. You know.
Okay.
There are. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah.
But, you know, and everybody knows that I make fun of crystals and candles and
life coaches and
yeah,
all of that. All right. How did you begin? Okay, so you started off writing with the blog, but how did blogging turn into book publishing?
Well, so I think we have to go back to podcasting before we go from blogging to book publishing. So, you know, what started as one interview eventually became a weekly series because Josh referred me to one person and that person referred me to another. And somehow, eventually, I landed on a guy named Sid Savara, who actually didn't think very much of my writing. So he actually thought I was a pretty lousy writer. In fact, to this day, he's still, like, I remember even he co-founded the podcast with me and he would never let me guest post on his blog.
Really?
Yeah, because he was like, your writing is not good enough.
Where is he now?
He's in Hawaii, and we're still good friends. I mean, he's so. But he, you know, I wrote him a letter saying, "Hey, I'm starting this multi-author blog, and I'm wondering if you're interested in contributing to it." And he said no. And then he wrote me this lengthy email about, which is in the book, and he wrote me this really long email about how he liked the interviews that I was doing, but he said that, you know, it would be much more successful if I spun it out into a separate site. And so I just replied back and said, great, when do you want to get started? I don't think that's what he was expecting. So I think within a day, I sent him like 3 versions of mock-ups. I didn't know how to design. So I was like, hey, what do you think? Is this what you had in mind? He was like, oh, he's like, you were serious. I'm like, well, you said you want to start it, so I need some help. So I dragged him along for the first year, and then he bowed out, you know, halfway through. He's kind of like, yeah, he's like, there's not enough short-term upside, which was fine. We parted on good terms.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, he co-founded the podcast with me, and you know, because he knew a lot of stuff about online marketing and like running, you know, email lists and all the stuff that I just didn't know or had no interest in, because I knew what I was good at was creating. So we did, you know, 100+ interviews, and I think somewhere along the way, like, and I mean, of course, you're interviewing lots of authors, so naturally, especially in the beginning, we're interviewing lots of bloggers, so all of them were writers. So naturally, at some point, you start to inherit some of that inevitably, and so you start becoming curious. And you know, like I'd read numerous stories of people who had gone from starting a blog to a book deal. I mean, of course, I told all those stories. That was the bulk of what the podcast was, is finding people like this. And so, you know, I think there was a through line throughout this entire process of publishing and making things. That was really what I loved doing. And, you know, where did we go to publishing books? I think, you know, really we have to fast forward to 2013. Because I wrote a lot of guest posts on other blogs. I wrote a lot of articles. I was always a prolific writer. But the thing is, like, I never quite got, you know, serious momentum or liftoff. And I started contributing to this blog called Grow that was run by a guy named Mark Schaefer. And in 2013, I emailed him. I said, hey, Mark, you know, I know that I'm no longer writing for Grow, but I really would love to self-publish a book. And I'm wondering if I could take the content that I've produced for Grow and compile it into a book. And he actually said, yeah, that's fine. And he had paid me for the content, so it was even nicer, really nice of him to do that because he didn't have to. He owned it. And he said, yeah, I think it'll be good for you. And that book ended up being called The Small Army Strategy. And for some reason, it just struck a chord. It sold, you know, 1,000 copies, and most traditionally published books don't sell 1,000 copies. So when that happened, I kind of, you know, then I think the next sort of significant inflection point was that I realized that I really probably had no shot of ever getting hired anywhere, or at least I thought I did. Now I probably have a much greater shot at getting hired if I wanted to, as weird as that is.
Would you actually do that? Would you actually sit in an office somewhere?
I applied for a job at IDEO a while back because I saw the job description. I was like, this looks like it would be fun. So it really would depend. I mean, if it was the kind of environment that would allow me to continue doing this kind of stuff, then yeah. I mean, that job, I was like, it's IDEO. I mean, it seemed like an amazing job. I was like, yeah. I mean, it would have to be an opportunity that would blow my mind. Granted, you know, you know, if I had to sacrifice the surfing, the answer would be no.
Okay.
So
let's go back. We were talking about small army strategy. That's how your writing career got started.
Yeah.
And how did it transition from there?
Well, so, you know, we reached this point where, you know, you realize, okay, well, I'm not going to, probably have a job, because one thing that people don't know is I was interviewing for jobs actually between 2011 and 2013. And I don't know that I've ever talked about this publicly.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I was looking, because much to the dismay of my parents, like Unmistakable Creative wasn't quite what it is now. It didn't seem like there really was a career to be made out of this. So I was stuck in this perpetual catch-22 though, because every time I went in for an interview, the very thing that would get me in the door, which was the body of work I'd built, would be the very reason nobody wanted to hire me. They would say, this doesn't look like some side project, it looks like you're going to leave the second you don't need us. I was like, yeah, that's true. So, at that point I was kind of like, all right, if that's true, I wonder what would happen if I started to write in this very sort of radically, honest and transparent way. And so that, eventually became this crazy series of Facebook status updates, which I know you've read because we've been Facebook friends for a long time, and a lot of people listening probably have read. Mm-hmm. And after about 6 months of what I jokingly refer to as committing career suicide, one Facebook status update at a time, I compiled all of that into a book, had Mars Dorian design a cover, uploaded it to Amazon, and called it The Art of Being Unmistakable. And that, I think, was really kind of the seed. That planted the seed for eventually what would happen. We can get into the media circus that erupted from that.
Actually, I want to, because that was a pivotal moment, and so much of your book talks about pivotal moments. So explain the pivot that took place with The Art of Being Unmistakable.
So to explain the pivot that took place with The Art of Being Unmistakable, I think we also have to talk about two other things that took place. One is the presence of Greg Hartle in my life, because it would be really kind of weird not to mention him in this conversation, given the role that he played. And then the other is AJ Leon. So around the same time, probably around May of 2013, I was introduced to AJ, and he asked me to come and speak at a conference in Fargo. And at the same time, for some unexplainable reason, Greg had contacted me a few months ago and said, hey, I want to finish up this project that I'm doing, and I want you to help me write a book. I'm like, well, why would you ask me? I'm like, there's lots of published authors. And so, we got to talking, and once a week we would check in, and I would, the first maybe 2 weeks I gave him advice, and the rest of the time it was me asking him for advice. And eventually we were in Fargo, and he said, I want you to come and join a company that we're working on as the marketing director. And I was like, Greg, I've been fired from every job I've been at. That's a really bad idea. And so he said, it's not a job. He said, you want to hold equity in startups, you'll be an equity holder. And he said, and if you don't come and do it, we're going to ask you to find the person for us. I was like, well, I don't want to have to find your employee for you, so I'll do it. And I said, but in exchange, I want you to mentor me to get this business to the next level, which, he did. And as Greg jokingly says, the worst thing to ever do is to try to hire me, because you will do more work for me than I will for you, which anybody can attest to.
We could do an entire podcast about Greg Hartle.
Yeah, we really could.
Yeah.
So Greg ended up playing this very pivotal role in really kind of teaching me how to run things as a business. And then Art of Being Unmistakable came along, and one of Greg's biggest contribution was the name Unmistakable Creative. Like, he had the foresight to see that we had a body of work that didn't have a brand identity or an ethos, and he knew it needed that, and I knew I wanted it. I just wasn't sure what it was. And I think the biggest thing that Art of Being Unmistakable did is it revealed that to us, what that sort of ethos was.
Okay, so you had a mentor coach with Greg. What happened next?
So the Art of Being Unmistakable ended up through a series of freakish coincidences in the hands of Glenn Beck. So, I didn't know anything about Glenn Beck at the time. I was kind of like, oh, better go look up this Glenn Beck guy, because I tweeted saying, oh, my book is #1 in the entrepreneurship category, and somebody tweeted back saying, you might want to thank Glenn Beck. He raved about your book on his show today. I was like, okay. And I didn't know anything about him, so I did a few Google searches. I was like, wow, this guy's really not well liked. And I remember, looking through my Facebook feed the moment I posted up, like all these comments. I was like, this is really weird. And then I think a day later, I get an email from Glenn personally saying, I love this book. I'd really like to meet you and have you come and talk. I have an audience that needs to hear this message. And so a week later, I found myself in Dallas talking to Glenn Beck. And, the book ended up selling, I think, 15,000 copies. And it was like the #8 book on all of Amazon the day after. And so suddenly, like overnight, it appeared that, we kind of had this overnight success. And, we got a lot of cash all at once, which honestly was poured into building the Unmistakable brand. Mm-hmm. And so after that, you know this well because you were part of it. We planned a live event called the Instigator Experience with 60 speakers and 9 attendees, which I always jokingly call the wedding with no wife at the end of it. And so, that ended up selling out in 2 weeks. Then right after that, we launched the Unmistakable Creative brand. And so then that takes us into 2014. If you want to do a deep dive into 2014, I'll let you ask the questions. And I kind of don't, but.
I'm going to hold off on that. I actually want to jump ahead.
Good.
I mean, we could do a podcast about Art of Being Unmistakable.
Yeah.
We could do a podcast about Greg Hartle.
Sure.
You've got a new book coming out.
Yeah.
Unmistakable, Why Only is Better Than Best. Why did you write it?
So, well, first, I guess it's important to talk about where it came, how it came about. I had this piece on a website called medium.com titled How Writing 1,000 Words a Day Changed My Life, because I've always abided by this habit of writing 1,000 words a day for probably the better part of the last 5 years. Mainly because when I started working with Greg, there was all these demands on my content production because I was also doing freelance writing. They wanted me to write articles for their company. And I realized, I was like, well, I'm not skilled enough to be able to pull off this much content on a daily basis. The only way I'm going to deal with this is through just sheer volume. And so through that process, I ended up realizing, wow, this is one of the best possible things I could have done for myself as a writer. And so I became a much better writer. So fast forward to 2 years, 2015, an editor at Penguin finds this article and sends me an email saying, hey, I love everything that you are up to and I'd like to talk about a book. So we went back and forth on a lot of different ideas. This wasn't the first idea that we talked about, and we couldn't agree on anything. And the funny thing is they made an offer before we even knew what the book was going to be. And so basically we thought, okay, you're going to revise and expand the Art of Being Unmistakable and go deeper. And
so part two, basically.
It really isn't.
That's what they were
That's
expecting.
what we were thinking, is that this would be part two. If I were to explain it this way, I'd say, the first book is the seed, this book is the fruit. And, I don't think the first book really, it didn't, go as deep as this does into the entire idea of Unmistakable because, when that first book came out, we weren't even called the Unmistakable Creative. The truth is that the entire sort of ethos of Unmistakable, is much more developed now than it ever was when that book came out. And so, now we've had probably 300-400 interviews under the new brand, and and the thing is, the perspective changed drastically because we brought in a much wider swath of guests. We went from sort of being known as these people who interview bloggers to the podcast who interviews weirdos like bank robbers and drug dealers and performance psychologists and graffiti artists and entrepreneurs and authors and venture capitalists. I mean, that was very deliberate. One of the things that I remember very distinctly. There was a moment, to speak of Greg, Greg's gift is seeing the future. We were sitting on my couch and we were going through, various versions of the design and taglines and stuff. And if you remember, the very first tagline was candid conversations with creative entrepreneurs and insanely interesting people. And Greg said the insanely interesting people part is the most important piece of that. And I said, why? He said, because if you want to have a presidential candidate in 2016, that needs to be there. It can't just be a podcast for entrepreneurs. He was thinking that far ahead. And the reality is we've been basically able to get a lot of people that we would have never gotten under the other umbrella. And so when my editor at Penguin came to me, she said, I don't think you're done with this idea. And it's a really big idea because if we look at sort of, how do you define unmistakable? And the idea of unmistakable is that you've created something so distinctive that nobody else could have done it but you, and it's immediately recognized as something that you did. And of course, the example that always comes to the top of mind immediately is Mars Dorian, who, if you look at the chapter illustrations in the book, he's the one who did them. But I have to credit him for the idea because he's the one who told me. He said, I want to create things that are so unique that he said, you don't even have to put your name on it. He said, I want people to look at my work and know that I was the one who did it. And so I thought, wait a minute, that's, if you could apply that across other art forms and, other areas of business, that's really powerful because it makes the entire concept of competition irrelevant. So you have no competition because if you're the only person who does what you do in the way that you do it, people don't price shop, they don't compare. So, when we work with Mars, there's no negotiations, there's no shopping around. We're not looking for other artists. We send him an email, how much is it going to cost? He sends us a quote, and we're like, okay, cool. That's kind of the way our process has worked. Unfortunately, he hasn't gouged us, but who knows after this book comes out.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to have you read a passage from the book here because it's exactly in line with what you've just been talking about.
Okay. So when you're truly unmistakable, the competition becomes completely irrelevant. You're not the best option, you're the only option. When you're the only option, people don't price shop, compare, or wait for what you're selling to go on sale. If you're the only option, people will wait in line to buy your product or work with you regardless of what it costs or in some cases, regardless of what you're selling.
Exactly. So earlier I asked why you wrote the book.
Yeah.
But your answer was kind of why in terms of business.
Okay, sure.
I want to know why.
Why personally?
Up here,
Yeah.
And here, why you wrote the book. What is it inside of you that you had to get out?
So I'll tell you what it is. In one way, I guess you could say the book is an epic rant on things that bothered me on the internet. And I won't tell you what I jokingly say the other title could have been.
I know.
Seeing as the fact that my editor is probably listening to this. So the thing is that one of the things, when I looked at the internet, when you have done so many interviews, you're exposed to like such a wide variety of creative projects and ideas and insights. And I kept seeing a pattern that drove me just to the point of madness. I would see somebody do something really successful, and then I would see a bunch of people try to replicate that thing and fail, like not even come close, and create things that were basically a pale imitation. It's like the life coaching client who goes to the life coach to discover that their calling in life is to become a life coach, which is just ridiculous. And that's just one example. That's the one I harp on the most because it's probably my favorite one. But there are others. If you look at Humans of New York, for example, do a search for Humans of on Facebook, and you'll find a Humans of project for every other city. Christian Lander created this blog called Stuff White People Like, and right after that, there's like a ton of copycats, right? Sure. And the thing, the other reason I think this is so deeply personal to me is that's how my whole story began, is with attempting to replicate something that I saw work. I started this website, which we didn't talk about. It was called 100 Reasons You Should Hire Me, and it was a failure because I couldn't come up with 100 reasons why anybody should hire me.
Well,
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the Irobot Roomba robot vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable.
You touch on this in the book, though. I mean, all great work starts off initially as imitation. I mean, sure. Austin Kleon, steal like an artist. You have your inspirations, you have the people you admire, you have your heroes. You look to them for some basic guidance.
Right.
And at some point, it's your choice whether to copy them, to follow along, or to go off on your own, still using their skill and their creativity as inspiration.
So yeah, I mean, like AJ Leon has had a profound influence on everything I've done, but our work doesn't look like his.
Sure.
So I think that we have to really understand there's a distinction between guidance and gospel, and the problem is that we treat the word of authority figures more like gospel than guidance. And that to me is really what's so detrimental, because the truth is like I may say something, it doesn't mean you have to agree with it. I don't agree with everything everybody says on the Unmistakable Creative. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of guests I'm like, okay, I don't agree with that, but so the other thing that you see is, especially because it comes from authority figures. So for example, somebody will go out and say everybody should start a podcast. I'm like, no, that's not really true. There are people who shouldn't start podcasts because they have other talents that are meant to be expressed in different ways. And by doing something like starting a podcast, they're denying the one thing that could make them unmistakable, or does make them unmistakable, and adding more noise to the world. And so the problem is that the people who say these things have big platforms, big audiences, and so-called authority. And I think it's actually very dangerous and detrimental to creative work to treat everything they say as the word of God, which a lot of people do.
Okay. You talk about this quite a bit in the book. How do you find your calling?
I mean, I think finding a calling is really about indulging curiosity more than anything, right? The thing that happens, I think, as we get older, if you look at life, right, you are constantly taught to choose from options that are put in front of you, and as you get older, those options become narrower and narrower. Like if you're in college,
You can make them narrower.
yeah, I mean, the thing is that nobody tells you don't have to choose from those options.
Right.
And that's the thing that I think is really important, is to realize that, wait a minute, there's a whole other set of options that nobody has put in front of me that might actually be better than the ones that people have put in front of me. And so I think that's a big part of it. And exploration, curiosity. I think the other thing is, I mean, if you look at what we do and the way we work at Unmistakable Creative, like there's a tremendous amount of experimentation that goes into everything that we do. By the time you see something that we've done, it's probably been through 100 iterations. Catherine's in the room; she can attest to this. I mean, luckily she nails it pretty much the first or second time, but she's also been victim to my madness of redo this.
That's not madness. You're
Yeah.
right most of the time.
Yeah. So, the thing is that
It's madness.
yeah, everybody who works with us, we kind of have to tell them, like, you're going to hate the process, but you'll love the result. And again, I can, blame Greg for that, because he taught me to work that way. I mean, we just, and Mars has dealt with us on this as well. Like, we push him to his limits. Like, we have pushed him to a breaking point. I remember doing it, and I was like, but then you saw the product. You saw the byproduct of what, that work was. So I think part of it is having the guts to do a lot of experimentation. And, the thing is, the cost of our mistakes, thanks to Derek, are not too high. He makes sure that we don't make very expensive mistakes, but the thing is that we're willing to make mistakes. Like, we're willing to make public mistakes and get feedback. So, we have a perfect example is how we planned the Instigator experience. I didn't start out by, saying, okay, we're planning a $1,300 conference, and I booked the venue and I've paid for the venue. That would have been stupid, because I didn't know anybody was coming. I mean, if there's anything we learned from, the failure of the second one, it's, how to deal with stuff like this. But, we started with a landing page that was as basic as it could get. It was like just a bunch of inspirational psychobabble with enter your email here. And, by the time we put tickets on sale, there were 600 people on the list, and we needed 60 of them. And it was sold out in 2 weeks. On the flip side of that, the second time around, we thought we were going to do well, and we didn't. We had a bigger list, and we were, sitting around negotiating with the venue. We put in a clause saying, hey, if this thing, we need a refund clause in there. And this time we've learned, to just put that into the contract. If there's anything we've learned, it's never to sign any contract where we have any downside in the situation.
Okay. So let's come back to the book here. If you would, walk me through the chapters, walk me through the content.
Okay.
What's inside?
What's inside? So, obviously we've talked about surfing as a metaphor for business, life, and creativity. So, the introduction is kind of, how I came to this conclusion and where the idea of Unmistakable came from. So, people have downloaded the introduction for free. But so, when you get to the water, the first thing that you do after you put on your wetsuit is you paddle out into the water, and you paddle out to a certain point, because waves break on shore. Like, waves break, a couple yards offshore, and then they come to shore, and that's how you ride them. Like, if you've ever seen the ocean, you'll see surfers actually ride parallel. And waves don't just come straight; they're all parallel. And so you're going from where you're starting to where you're at. So you have to paddle out to the takeoff point. So in the process of the paddle out, there are a lot of things that happen. I mean, there's going to be sometimes obstacles in your way, like rocks. There's sometimes other surfers yelling at you. You're trying to dodge things. I mean, usually it's one of the smoother parts of the journey. But the thing is that a lot of people kind of sit there with their feet stuck in the sand, because it can be paralyzing to do something that you've never done before or go out. And so it's a perfect sort of analogy for what it's like to get in the water.
You've just described entrepreneurshp.
Yeah, more or less.
You have.
Yeah, that really that's the idea is that there's no amount of watching and reading and all of this stuff that's going to give you the same experience as actually being in the environment, right? Like, you can watch 100 surf videos, and I can promise you, if you get in the water with me, you're going to fall. And you're not going to stand up, because it's a totally different experience. Like, all these things that are not there. So, basically, surfers start with what's known as a land lesson, right? If you're with a surf instructor, he'll simulate the experience of standing up on a surfboard, and you'll say, okay, he's like, yeah, just push yourself up. Of course, what he doesn't tell you is, by the way, water and land and moving water are two entirely different experiences.
Right.
So basically, the land lesson is completely useless when you get into the water.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of falling. It's a lot of getting yelled at by other people who know what they're doing, and and eventually you figure it out.
Okay. So you've got the paddle out.
So the paddle out, and then that takes you into the lineup, right? So the lineup is basically what we refer to all the other people in the water, all the other surfers, as the lineup. And in any lineup, there's always going to be people who have more talent and more skill than you do. It's just a given, especially if you're at a surf spot that is popular. which means you just have to bring it. And if you do things like hesitate on waves, if you do things like cut people off, like if you make mistakes, you lose the respect of the lineup really fast. Like for example, just a few weeks ago, I was at this place in San Clemente where I surf. I mean, you and I have been down there where you photographed in a place called Trestles, and we saw a guy call another guy off a wave and just eat shit after he called the other guy off. That kind of thing basically causes you to lose a lot of respect. It's like you can't call somebody off a wave and then fall. It's just so the lineup basically is a metaphor for competition, because the thing is, when we look at the world that we live in today, the sheer volume of noise that we're dealing with, the sheer volume of competition that we're dealing with is at a level that's unlike anything we've ever seen, because what's happened is that technology has democratized our ability to create and to share ideas and tell stories, but in that process, it has also raised the bar significantly in terms of what's expected, because there's so many people competing for your attention.
Right, which goes into the topic of longevity, which is huge in here.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to have you read that part right there.
Okay.
It goes on to the next page.
Anyone can put a piece of art on Instagram for a week. Anyone can write a blog for 90 days, which is the time frame when most people quit. Anyone can record 10 episodes of a podcast. With longevity, you start to build and earn the trust of an audience.
How does that compare? So what aspect of that relates to the lineup?
So the thing is that, when you first enter a lineup and you're unrecognized in the lineup, you're not, welcome. Like if you look at a place like the Bonsai Pipeline in Hawaii, there's a pecking order. You and I will never even be allowed in the water there. Like if I showed up there with a surfboard, I'd get a lot of dirty looks. Like you have to be vetted by the people in the lineup. And the thing is that if you start showing up regularly at the place that you surf, you start to earn the respect of the lineup, because like, okay, wait a minute, you're not just here for today. So, for example, I've surfed at Trestles for the better part of 4 years now. I mean, most of those people in the water are my friends. I see them every day. Like they've become friends. But the funny thing is, I remember when I started noticing some of these guys, I would hear them yell at people and think, what a bastard. And now they're friends of mine. And I'm like, now I know why they yelled at those people, because those people are idiots sometimes. And everybody starts out not knowing what they're doing. But longevity is such a critical component. I think the other thing I said about longevity was, something that came from Sam Altman, who was the president of Ycombinator. He tells startup founders that your greatest competitive advantage is a long-term view, because so few people have one. But he defined a long-term view as 10 years. Then that's, for most of us, that seems unfathomable, because we think 1 year is a long time, which it's not at all. Right. If you actually start to tease apart and really look at the careers of people who've done things of great significance.
Sure. Part 3, the drop.
That has been one of the most interesting chapters, because every single person who is in some sort of a transition who has read this book has sent me a note saying, this is the chapter that I feel that I can relate to most. So basically what the drop is a metaphor for, so when you're surfing, you basically paddle for a wave, and if you like for anybody listening, I would recommend that you actually go watch a YouTube video to see what I'm talking about, because it'll make a lot more sense. Because it's a bit hard to describe visually. But what happens is you see a wave coming and you start paddling for a wave. And so between paddling and pushing up on the wave and actually standing up, there's one moment which is called the drop. And that's basically what gives you the speed to get into the wave, because you're paddling parallel so that the wave carries you and you stand up. But the thing is, the drop is all about one thing. So it's all about commitment. If you actually screw it up, you'll either fall, you'll get tossed. It's actually worse to hesitate than it is to totally go for it and eat shit, because you're much more likely to get hurt when you hesitate. I know, because I've seen it happen. It's happened to me at times when I'm like, okay, that was sketchy. I should have just gone for it. Yeah. And of course, the more challenging the wave is, the steeper the drop is. So on certain waves, the drop literally feels as if you're like just making a vertical drop on a surfboard.
So what's the analogy to the business world, the entrepreneur world?
I think the analogy there is really about commitment, right? Because often when we try to make a change, our efforts in a lot of cases are half-assed. Or what you often see, this is something I've seen over and over again, is somebody will try something for a very short period of time, and then they'll decide and declare that it's a failure. And it's like, wait a minute, you just gave it 2 months. How can you possibly say this is a failure? So it's really all about commitment. That's what the whole idea of the drop is.
Why do you think people hesitate? Not necessarily when they're at the drop in the water, but why do they hesitate in life, in business?
Because everything you're dealing with is an unknown, but that's also what makes it so thrilling, right? Like every wave is different. If surfing was the same every time you went out, it wouldn't be that much fun. That's probably what makes it so addictive, is that the novelty never wears off. It's 7 years later, or now at the end of this year, it'll be 8. And I can tell you, every time we go out, we're like, wow, this could be better than the next time. It could be worse than the next time. I mean, there are days when you're just like, why the hell did we make the drive to come here? But the novelty never wears off. And I think a lot of people, when it comes to entrepreneurial endeavors or anything that they're starting, there's a tremendous fear of the unknown because we spend our lives being conditioned into seeking out certainty. And the reality is that what you start to figure out at a certain point is that certainty is really an illusion. There is no certainty.
I love this quote. It's from Laird Hamilton. I'm going to have you read it.
Okay.
Though you're not Laird.
Okay. Fear is an unbelievable motivator, but it also makes people freeze in their tracks. Once you understand it, fear becomes something you can tap into. Fear comes from understanding that you can die. It usually makes me make really good decisions and gives me power. Yeah. And Laird makes much more important decisions than I do, seeing as to the fact the consequences of his screw-ups are death.
Literally. Next chapter is... Awkward pause. Sorry. What is the next chapter, Srini?
The ride.
The ride. Tell me about the ride.
So the ride, basically, once you're standing up on a board, that's where surfing actually happens. And the interesting thing about being in the water is you can be in the water for 3 hours. You'll be spending 2 minutes of it actually surfing, like actually riding waves. Because the rides are really short. That's why it's so hard to get good at it. Most people who are really good surfers have been doing it almost their entire lives, and even the bulk of those people don't have the skill to become pros. But the ride really, I think, in my mind, was a metaphor for mastery of any sort of craft, because it's all about, the ride is where you go from being, entirely dependent on people who have guided you and mentored you and people that you have learned from, to a combination of things. One, an extreme demonstration of skill combined with style. It's where basically, I guess the metaphor I use is you graduate from that stupid foam soft top board to a real surfboard. And when you get off that soft top board, you'll find at first it's incredibly difficult. But the thing is that you also eventually realize, wait a minute, the world just opened up to me. It's like going from driving a Hummer to suddenly having a Ferrari. Is really kind of the analogy when you go from one of those big boards to a shorter board. And it basically amplifies the entire experience of riding a wave. And so, you look at what truly goes into mastery. It's very similar to those people who become, masterful surfers. Thousands of hours of water time, much of it actually not riding waves, but getting used to being in the water. Because like getting used to the environment itself is I always say it's like adjusting to life in a new city.
But there are roadblocks, or to use the water analogy, the impact zone.
Well, so the impact zone, that would be the next chapter, so we can talk about that. So basically, there's a section, if you watch surfers, you'll see this. Just do a search for like a bonsai pipeline video on YouTube. There's a section known as the impact zone where you're basically taking wave after wave after wave on the head, because waves come in sets, and sometimes you don't get to the takeoff point before the set starts. So you're kind of stuck. Every time you lift your head up, there's another wave coming, and you're just like, you just get beat down one after another. And there's no way to avoid that. Like, the only way to avoid it is not to surf. And each time you're in it, it gets a little less heavy and it doesn't shake you as much. But there are still plenty of days, like I was surfing in El Salvador, and I looked off in the horizon. I'm like, oh shit, like this is not going to be good. And I'm and the sun is going down, and I'm like, I'm probably one of 3 guys in the water, and I'm the least skilled surfer in the water. And you kind of know it's going to be heavy. You're like, okay, you probably be held underwater for a while. I'm going to come up for air, and the moment I come up for air, there's going to be another like 10-foot bomb that I'm going to take on the head, and I'm going to be underwater again for a little while. And you're basically just like gasping for breath. I think the thing you try to remember is not to panic, and that's hard because it's really scary, especially because those waves are big and they're powerful. And so I think, I looked at the impact zone as sort of a metaphor for going through very dark and difficult times. I think that to me it just described it, because you literally feel like it's never going to end. But the thing is that, like I said, waves come in sets. So at some point, it all kind of calms down and you make your way back to the takeoff point. And if you're smart, you never paddle out while a set's coming in, because that's just stupid. So usually we'll just stand on shore and we're like, okay, that's gonna hopefully, and sometimes you'll time it thinking you're gonna get out there without, getting just wrecked. And right as you paddle out, another set starts. And you're just like, okay, great. So
it seems like the way to survive the impact zone is grit?
Well, I mean, the way to survive the impact zone is grit and determination, and also the experience of being in it. Like the thing is, it shakes you less every single time because you've been it. It's about basically the thing that once used to be incredibly uncomfortable eventually becomes comfortable. Like, I can surf a 4 to 5 foot day and take a few waves on the head. I'm like, all right, cool, I can hack this. I know I'm not going to die or drown. Whereas, you put me in 10-foot surf, I've only experienced that 1 or 2 times, and every time I was just like, okay, this is too big. It's not within my skill level. So I think what really prepares you for it is the experience of being in it. There's nothing, I think I talked to somebody recently, I said it's a bit, you take very emotionally charged experiences. So for example, let's look at something like the death of a parent, right? I can read every book on losing a parent imaginable, but I'm never going to have the understanding of it that somebody who's actually lost a parent has.
Okay. We've purposefully been using a lot of surf analogies.
Yeah.
But how does all this apply to entrepreneurs, artists, creatives? How can they take these analogies, this storyline, and apply it to their life and become unmistakable?
Okay, so how they become unmistakable, that's a lengthy conversation, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
I mean, every one of these things represents a phase of the creative process.
Right.
They're metaphors for a certain phase. Like, you start knowing nothing. You start having to deal with competition. It takes an incredible amount of commitment and resilience to see a creative project to, however you define success, regardless of what that is. It's going to take, time and longevity and commitment. If you're committed to it, it's going to require commitment to mastery, and inevitably there are going to be impact zones, like where you're going to be tested. Those moments, I think, are the ultimate tests of how bad you really want to. How bad do you really want this thing? Like, are you willing to persist through this horrible time? When we called 2014 my impact zone, and Greg Hartle gave me 3 options. I remember very distinctly. He called me. It was a couple days before Thanksgiving. He said, "All right, here's the deal." And he's like, everything is shit right now, more or less, which it was. He said, you can shut the whole thing down, and we can talk about it, how to do that if you want. He said, we can cash it out, pay out your money, and you can quit. He said, you can go get a job, and you can do it on the side. Or he said, you can do option number 3, which is go all in. And when I said, well, what if I gave it a certain timeline? And he said, if you give it a certain timeline, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I thought that was really interesting, because a lot of people disagreed with that advice. But Brian gave me very good advice. He said, tell your parents about the timeline. He said, that'll appease them. So I told my parents about the timeline, not having any intention of quitting, and just persisted. So, I think really it's the impact zone is a test of how bad you want this thing you say you want.
Perfect. We are going to shift gears completely.
Cool.
Do a few rapid fire questions, grab some questions from the audience.
Okay.
And then drink some bourbon.
You can drink some bourbon. I have to go give a talk. I'll drink bourbon after that.
All right.
You have to drive me to the talk. How are you going to drink bourbon? I should be concerned, shouldn't I?
No. No, you shouldn't be. Do you have any heroes? Are there 1 or 2 people, not necessarily mentors, but people outside your life that you really look up to?
God, that's a hard question.
It could be an author. It could be.
Yeah, somebody asked me what one of my favorite books was. I was like, I had to look at my bookshelf. I'm like, I can't even.
Oh, that's actually this question right here.
Yeah, great. I don't know. I think I've borrowed ideas and insights from so many people. Not just people I've interviewed, but I'm reading this Walt Disney biography right now. The thing is, I've looked at so many people. I've read stuff about Steve Jobs, and I've borrowed certain elements because I don't think I think we have this idea in our mind of change the world, and the connotation is Mother Teresa, Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein, and I'm like, yeah, but I said in the book, I'm like, by definition, when you create something that didn't exist before, you change the world.
Right.
So
be your own hero?
Yeah, I guess maybe is a lesson.
Okay, very good. Actually, let's go to the book question. Not what is your favorite book, because
that would be hard.
That's silly.
Yeah.
But what 3 books do you think have had the most impact on your life?
The War of Art absolutely has had a profound impact.
And who wrote that?
By Stephen Pressfield.
Mm-hmm.
A.J. Leon's Life and Times of Remarkable Misfit, which I don't know if you could call it a book, but is a collection of essays that was supposed to be a book, but he returned the advance to his publisher and self-published it. And that ended up that was one of those things that just fundamentally shifted a lot of things for me. I'm trying to think of the third one. Believe it or not, it will be a cheesy self-improvement book, The Happiness Advantage by Sean Achor. Because why I like that book, and the funny thing is I shouldn't even call it a cheesy self-improvement book, because Sean Achor is a happiness researcher whose work is based on actual science, not motivational psychobabble. Like he's done research in labs, and all of the things that I've applied to my life that I learned from that book have actually made tangible differences, like measurable differences that I can literally tie things that I learned from that book to income that I've made. So,
okay. What's the most recent thing you've changed your mind about?
Oof.
Something that you've believed for a long time and you just realized, shit, that's not true.
I think that we've, in some ways, maybe I'm guilty of perpetuating it, is that we have perpetuated this mantra that everybody should follow this unconventional path and do their own thing. And maybe that's not true. Maybe some people are perfectly content and happy, with their lives the way they are. I think that the problem with what the internet has done, when you see stories like, in many cases, even the ones that I've been responsible for putting out into the world, is they take people who feel completely satisfied with their life and make them feel dissatisfied. And maybe that's not a bad thing, but maybe it is. In some cases, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. And I've seen people make bad decisions because of that.
Interesting. If you could send a message back in time to the Srini of 10 years ago, what would that message be?
Don't worry so much, more than anything else.
I think we all want to send that message back to ourselves.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is I have something written titled A Letter to My 18-Year-old Self somewhere on Medium.
You're 28?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my 20-year-old self, God, what was I like when I was 20? God, I mean... Confused, stressed out, worried.
So was 20-year-old Srini named to know about life?
If I could go and tell my 20-year-old self something, I would say, don't be so damn rigid about your plans. That was the biggest thing that I think I wish I would have done differently, because I was so hell-bent on things being a certain way, and none of it went according to plan anyways. So, that's I would say that. I think I was in a hurry to reach a certain point, and I think I missed a lot of things along the way because of that.
I think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are in a hurry to reach some level of achievement.
For sure.
Without even knowing why they want to reach that level of achievement. It's just something to do.
For sure.
Aside from your own podcast, who or what are you listening to on a regular basis?
So I don't know that there's anything I listen to on a regular basis, but there's stuff that I check and do on an occasional basis. There's a podcast by a guy named Sam Jones, who's a celebrity photographer. Mm-hmm. He runs a show called Offcamera, and I really like the show because he brings in very interesting people. Like, he's had actors, he's had photographers. I mean, anybody who can get Matt Damon, Cindy Crawford, and Laird Hamilton on his podcast. So the Sam Jones one, just because of the sheer diversity of people that he brings on. I'm trying to think of who else I've listened to recently. I started picking up the Malcolm Gladwell revisionist history
amazing.
one. That is incredible, I have to say.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're going to go to the audience. Raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask Srini. I will have to repeat it just because the mic's not going to pick it up. Man with the cell phone, yes.
I'd like to ask about that song again.
No.
I'd like to ask a little bit about your startup experience and sort of the finances around that, and how you kind of managed to make that.
Okay.
So let me repeat that real quick. So the question is about your startup experience and the finances behind it.
So startup in terms of building Unmistakable?
Yes.
Okay. This isn't the greatest question for me. There's a reason that I'm not in charge of the finances anymore, because I nearly ran the company in the ground in 2014. That's why I met coincidentally through the publication of Art of Being Unmistakable. That's another thing that's actually really significant that we never got to, is that I met Brian because of that book. He's the CEO of our company, and he emailed me out of the blue. He said, "Hey, I saw your Glenn Beck interview. Do you want to meet up and surf?" Which he was smart enough to know that I would never say no to that. And so, we got to surfing together, and Brian had built a skateboard company out of his parents' garage when he was in high school, and he had it in 27 stores in 2 years. So he knew a thing or two about running a business, and his family, his parents were both entrepreneurs. Really, there's two things I think that I've learned from both Brian and Greg. One is just the sheer importance of keeping track of things. Most people, I think, see that as a necessary evil, but it's been kind of said, and I can't take credit for this. I don't remember where I heard it, but measurement alone improves performance. And I know this because I saw what happened. When Greg got me into measuring, we went from $600,000 to $120,000 in 6 months in the bank. Like, it was kind of nuts to see that. I mean, a good amount of it was for our event, but it's still, you look at it, you're like, okay, we made massive strides because of that. So that is probably the biggest thing I would say is measurement, and then keeping costs down. We've intentionally, a lot of us, not taken salaries. Some of our team, like Derek still has another job, Brian still has another job. I'm the one who still, and there was a moment, I think, in 2014 where Greg said, if you want, you can take out more. And I didn't. I actually left in half of what I should have taken out. And that honestly saved us from going out of business. So, I'm not the best person to ask about finances. The one thing I know is that I shouldn't manage money. And you should keep track of all of it. That's what I would say.
Other questions? Sure.
Have you surfed the Oregon coast yet? And if not, when?
No, Bent's, a friend of Matt's, has tried to convince me multiple times, and he's like, you'll need a longboard. I'm like, so, and a really big, thick wetsuit, because I've heard it's bone chilling, so not yet. But maybe in the next couple of months. My guess is it probably is only good in the winter, unfortunately.
Short sands.
All right, good to know.
Oswald West?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great beach.
Good to know.
Other questions? Other questions? Mark Grimes, that's a great question you have there.
Right, it was, wasn't it? What book do you most give other people?
What book do you most give other people?
Or do you?
It's weird. I haven't gifted a lot of books so I don't have an answer. I probably should, seeing as the fact that I'm an author, and I shouldn't be my own book because that's obnoxious.
The A.J. Leon one.
Yeah, actually, well, I gifted that book to you. I usually send, actually, come to think of it, if anybody asks me for something inspiring to read, I always send them to The Life and Times of a Remarkable Misfit.
I'm going to second that. It's a fantastic read.
It really is. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. Ma'am?
My question is, how do you get people to be on your show?
Okay.
Question is, how do people get onto the Unmistakable Creative?
So there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, the weird thing is people always think that there's some sort of formula to it, and if there was some formula to it, it wouldn't be unmistakable, is what I always say. Because I don't want anybody to be able to replicate it. Nobody can, because it's all based on my morbid curiosity. So I take recommendations from people, like people will write in stuff, but more than anything, I think it comes down to, am I intrigued by this person? So that, first it starts with whether I want to have them. And then, of course, at this point, it's easier to get people because we've had so many. Once we mention who our roster is, almost everybody's like, yeah, I'll do this. And then they go and look at the iTunes reviews, like, okay, this won't be a complete waste of time. We end up getting a lot of very, powerful conversations out of people. To me, as an interviewer, I think my job is to shine a light on them and make them look their absolute best. And so because of that, we've been able to take our interviews and translate them into animated shorts and do all sorts of stuff that you could never do with a podcast. So curiosity is one. People will write in occasionally and recommend guests. Some people will pitch themselves, and sometimes when they pitch themselves, they're good. Sometimes they're bad. I will cut interviews in the middle of them if I think they suck. I will make people do multiple takes, which Rima can attest to, since I made her do 6 takes before we got it right. But it turned out phenomenal. So that's, I'm okay with that. So yeah, I guess that's really the answer.
So it's a mixed way.
It's really mixed. There's no sort of set thing. People always ask, what does it take? Is there a criteria? I was like, I wish I could give you a step-by-step criteria. My answer is no. I mean, I think that there's two things. Am I curious, and will this person be able to teach the audience something valuable? Can we entertain and educate at the same time? If we can accomplish one but not the other, then it's almost always a no.
I love your stuff. I love your podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sir?
There's some uninteresting people that sound very interesting through their stories, and there's some really interesting people that don't sound very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had both sides of that coin. So what allows people to project themselves in a light that makes them interesting?
Well, it's funny because you can take one person and depending on who the interviewer is, they may sound uninteresting on one podcast and they may sound brilliant on another. So I think part of it is, I think a big part of it is asking them questions that they don't typically get asked. You know, I mean, there's a reason that we start with, questions about people's childhoods and the kinds of things that most people won't ask them about. And we've even gotten more intentional about starting with more unusual questions because we're like, okay, you know what, it's taking too long to get to the point of flow with them. And so Brian actually had the foresight to see this. He's like, here's a list of questions, start with one of these. And he's like, ask people, and we had Sally Hogstad recently, and we said, what birth order were you, and what impact did that have on the choices you've made with your life? Weird question to start a conversation with, but that's not what they're expecting. Or my friend Erica Learmark, last week we had her, and I know her well, and I was like, so your dad has had this profound impact on your life. What's been the most valuable thing that you learned from your father? I stole that from the guy who Tim Ferriss interviewed, by the way, Cal Fussman, because he asked Gorbachev that, and I was like, great question. I'm going to absolutely ask that.
Have you interviewed James Altucher?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. I have a picture of James on my phone if you want.
We're friends on Facebook.
Oh, are you?
And we talk back and forth.
Yeah, we've had James.
What about Leonard Kim?
No.
No? Have you heard of Leonard Kim? He's a personal brand strategist.
Okay. Interesting.
Yes, sir.
How do you measure the success of your show, and how have those yardsticks changed over the years?
Okay, that's a fair question. The thing is, what we figured out at the beginning of this year was that there was one metric that mattered above all of them, and because we knew we had a book coming out, we're like, okay, what drives book sales? Email subscribers. That's it. Every other metric didn't really matter that much because I don't remember. It might have also been from the Startup School podcast series. One of the guys who. So what the Startup School podcast series is, the Ycombinator president basically, they teach a class at Stanford that is an entrepreneurship class in the computer science department, and they bring in founders from every Ycombinator portfolio startup to come and talk about a different subject area. They cover marketing, they cover sales, they cover operations. I mean, I had our entire team go through that twice, and it made a fundamental. We changed a lot of the way we operate. The major metrics we look at, of course, are revenue, because we want to make sure that we're bringing in money and not losing money. And then, but being, with a book launch coming, email was the number one thing. So it was kind of like, is that number bigger every single week? That was it. So much so that at the end of every week, I print it out and I tape it to the wall as a constant reminder, because I read about that in a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution, where they're like, if your metrics are visible and right in front of you, you're much more likely to pay attention to them. And I also had Derek set up our Slack channel so that every time somebody subscribes to our email, we kind of see what is going on. So we have a constant finger on the pulse of the most important metric. I'm at the point now where, I was just texting Brian last night, and this happens when I read crazy books. I read Accidental Billionaires. I was like, we need more growth. I'm like, figure out how to make that happen.
All right. One more question. Derek Wyatt.
Wow.
Seeing that this is a part of your life where you're riding a pretty good high, you've got your first self-published book. Are you looking forward to the next thing? Are you trying to enjoy the moment? What's next for Unmistakable You, or are you just trying to get through today?
First, I'm trying to get through today, but I'm looking forward to Matt driving me drunk to the next place. So that should be interesting.
There is rum out there.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, because I think that part of what I experienced in 2014 was going from an extreme high to an extreme low. So I'm wary of extreme highs at this point. And the thing is that actually this is a perfect time to echo the momentum window sentiment that Greg has taught me. Is that I would say are in a momentum window right now, and he had told me, he said, if you play your cards right, you'll make a quantum leap where you'll never be back down at the same level again. The part that maybe he left out but I figured out was that it doesn't matter. It's not only what you do in the momentum window, it's what you do right after that matters just as much, if not more. So people are like, what are you going to do Tuesday morning when the book comes out? I'm going to write 1,000 words. That's what I do every day. I mean, we'll have dinner and Brian will come over and we'll drink, but I will wake up and I will write 1,000 words. It'll be business as usual as far as I'm concerned. I think that, you should take a moment to celebrate. But I think about this thing that Stephen Pressfield talks about this in his book, Do the Work. And if you listen to the audio version, that's another book that actually had a profound impact, especially the audio version. He says, he finally, after 17 years of trying, finished something, and he went over to this guy Paul Rink's house, and Paul said, "Great, now start the next one." And conveniently, we have a next book to start. So the outline is due in October.
Perfect. Srini, I have 2 final questions for
Here
you.
comes the one that I
right.
was waiting for.
Oh, really? What do you
Yeah,
think
well,
it is?
I don't have an answer off the
What's
top
your
of my
favorite color?
Yeah.
No. Actually, where do you expect to be in 20 years?
Wow.
I mean, are you going to be sitting in front of a screen talking into a microphone 20 years from now?
It's
in
hard to say,
2036?
I couldn't tell you that I was going to be sitting in front of a screen talking to a microphone, even 10 years ago. I mean, look how far we've come. I think the interesting thing that is happening is that the gap between creativity and technology is narrower than it's ever been, and we're going to get it to a point where it's pretty much non-existent. I think that we will be able to do things like make the equivalent of a Hollywood feature film from our phones within the next 2 years, maybe 5. And the reason I say that is because I've seen some of what's possible. Like I was with a friend very recently, and he showed me drone footage that he shot from a vacation in Costa Rica. It looked like the opening sequence to a Hollywood film, and he shot it with a drone tied to his iPad.
That he probably paid $1,500 for.
Yeah, now that same drone camera is like $150 on Amazon. So no, I mean not necessarily. The thing is, if you remember, we started out as running a blog, then a podcast, and then an animated series. So I mean, will we run a podcast? Probably. I don't know, in 20 years. I mean, I don't think that I will ever stop creating media. That's kind of if there's a through line to all of this, it's that I like making things, and I like using technology to make different things in all forms of media. I never wanted to be just a podcast. I think that was something I could always look beyond that. I mean, there's probably one of my favorite things that I saw or read recently was in this Walt Disney biography that I'm reading, and it's really big and long, so I haven't read it as thoroughly as I'd like to. I'm going like 5 pages a day. But they said, when Walt Disney started in the earliest days, everything was about exceeding the limitations of the medium. And that's what I wanted to do with podcasting. So, you see things that are coming like virtual reality, augmented reality, all of this stuff. I think we're really kind of in the infancy. We're at the very beginning of another really big wave, and Kevin Kelly and I just talked about this, and he said, the Industrial Revolution is gonna pale in comparison to the next 50 years.
I would agree. Final question: how are you unmistakable?
Yeah. So I've thought about this because I knew you were going to ask this, and I think that what it really is perspective, right? Is that often aging gives us a perspective that we would never get any other way, and we can't get any other way. So you add that plus a combination of life experiences, the exposure to hundreds, if not thousands of people's ideas, all mixed together in only the way that I would have thought to mix them together. And that's what I would say makes me unmistakable is perspective.
I like that. And with that, we're going to wrap up the podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, Srini Rao.